The sky over New York cracked open at 6:14 in the morning, and nobody had time to be afraid before the fear became useless. Colonel Mara Osei stood on the observation deck of Cheyenne Mountain, watching the largest object anyone had ever tracked settle into orbit above the Pacific. It was not one ship. It was thousands, arranged in a lattice so precise it looked less like a fleet and more like a machine built to swallow a planet. The air in the command center had gone thin, not from any change in pressure, but from the collective breath that nobody was taking. "Talk to me," Mara said, and her voice did not shake, because if her voice shook, so would everyone else's. "Radio silence from them for the last 6 minutes," said the comms officer. "Before that, just noise, like they're calibrating something." Calibrating for what? Nobody answered, because nobody knew, and in the next second, they didn't need to guess anymore. Every screen in the room, every phone, every television and radio and emergency broadcast system on the surface of the earth lit up with the same message at the same moment, translated instantly and perfectly into every human language that existed. A voice, layered and strange, neither male nor female, introduced itself as High Speaker Threll of what it called the Coalition of Vashtar. It did not raise its voice. It did not need to. It simply stated calmly that humanity's sovereignty would be surrendered within 6 hours, that resistance was a statistical impossibility that had never once succeeded, and that compliance was the only rational path to survival. Then the signal cut, and the fleet did not move, and the 6-hour clock began. In a cramped office 3 floors below, Dr. Elias Cho sat with 4 monitors running the same 20-second clip of Threll's voice on a loop, stripping it apart syllable by syllable. He was a linguist by training, a translator by trade, and the kind of man who noticed things other people were too frightened to notice. He noticed, for instance, that despite the perfect confidence in the words, there was a strange, recursive stutter buried in the waveform, a half-second of vocal tension that appeared exactly twice, both times on the phrase, "has never once succeeded." He flagged it, sent it to Mara with a single line. "This isn't confidence, this is memorized confidence." Someone is reading a script they don't fully believe. Mara didn't have time to read it carefully. The United Nations Security Council, for the first time in its history, had unanimously approved a joint global defense command inside 90 minutes, a miracle that would have taken years under normal circumstances. Nations that had spent decades distrusting one another suddenly found a common language faster than any diplomat ever had. The language of a 6-hour countdown. Fighter wings scrambled from a dozen countries. Naval fleets moved into defensive formation. Every satellite still functioning was repurposed to track the alien lattice, and every scientist who understood physics, chemistry, or metallurgy was pulled into a single sprawling effort to figure out what, if anything, human weapons could do against something that had crossed the stars. The answer, quietly, was probably nothing. But nobody said the word surrender out loud, not once, not even the ones who were thinking it. Mara walked the length of the command center at hour 4, past officers from 6 continents hunched over terminals, past a wall of monitors now showing city populations moving underground in long, gray rivers of people. She found Cho still at his desk, headphones on, muttering the same phrase over and over in 3 different accents, trying to catch the shape of it. "You said this wasn't confidence," she said. Cho pulled off his headphones. "I think whoever wrote this speech has said it 100 times before, to 100 different species, and every time it worked in the first hour. I think this is the first time they've had to sit through hour 4. "Meaning what?" "Meaning I don't think they know what happens next any more than we do." Mara didn't answer. She didn't have the luxury of hope, not with 300 aircraft in the air and a planet's population holding its breath. But she filed the thought away, because in a war where humanity had no weapon capable of matching the enemy, uncertainty in the enemy's voice was the only weapon they had. At hour 5, the fleet began to move, not toward Earth but away from it, sliding back into a wider, more cautious formation, the kind a predator uses when it realizes the thing in front of it might actually have teeth. Radar stations across the planet reported the shift within seconds of each other. In the command center, someone actually laughed, a short, disbelieving bark of sound, before Mara silenced the room with a look. "They're not attacking," said the tactical officer. "They're repositioning defensively." "Against what?" Mara asked. "We haven't fired a single shot." Nobody had an answer for that either. The 6-hour deadline came and went in total silence. No missiles fell. No beams of light tore through the atmosphere. The fleet simply sat there, farther away now than it had been at the start, its thousands of ships arranged in a pattern that looked, if you squinted, less like an invasion and more like a wary circle drawn around a fire nobody wanted to touch. Cho was the one who caught the final transmission, 7 minutes after the deadline passed. It wasn't meant for Earth. It was a fragment of internal coalition chatter, bounced off a relay satellite and picked up by accident. Badly garbled, but not garbled enough to hide the meaning. Threll's voice again, but different now. No calm, no script, just something raw and confused bleeding through the translation software in broken half-formed phrases. "They are not afraid." Why are they not afraid? Cho played it 3 times before he called Mara over. She listened once, arms crossed, jaw tight, and then looked up at the wall of screens showing the alien fleet holding its distance above a planet that, by every rule these creatures had apparently followed for longer than human civilization had existed, should already belong to them. "He sounds scared," Cho said quietly. "He should be," Mara said, though she didn't believe it yet. Not really. Not the way she would an hour from now, when the first coalition strike craft broke formation and began a slow, deliberate descent toward the eastern seaboard, moving not like conquerors sweeping in to claim a prize, but like soldiers being sent, reluctantly, to test whether the fire in front of them could actually burn. The first alien strike craft died 11 seconds after it crossed into American airspace, and the pilot who killed it had broken 4 regulations doing it. Captain Danny Reyes hadn't waited for the formation to lock, hadn't waited for targeting confirmation from command, hadn't waited for anything except the moment the alien fighter dipped low enough over the coastline that her instincts, honed over a decade of flying in weather no simulator could replicate, told her it would bank left. It banked left. She was already there. The missile she fired wasn't supposed to work. Every briefing that morning had said coalition shielding was theoretically impenetrable to human ordnance. But theory hadn't accounted for a strike craft moving through turbulence it had never been designed to fly in, shields flickering as it fought crosswinds no starship pilot had ever needed to understand. It went down in the water 3 miles offshore, and for 1 full second, the entire eastern seaboard defense net went completely silent, as if nobody could quite believe what had just happened. Then the radios exploded with noise, and the real battle began. It wasn't the battle the coalition had planned for. Threll had sent only a probing force, 12 strike craft, a fraction of what waited in orbit, expecting the same pattern that had played out on every world the coalition had ever tested. Initial resistance, rapid collapse, formal surrender within the hour. Instead, the strike craft found themselves flying into airspace crawling with aircraft flown by pilots who didn't fight like a unified military. They fought like 11 different militaries improvising off each other in real time, breaking formation, doubling back, using terrain and weather and sheer unpredictability the way water finds cracks in stone. Vec watched it from a data terminal on Threll's flagship and felt something curdle in his stomach that he didn't have a word for yet. He was young for an intelligence officer, young enough that this was only his 3rd deployment and he had been trained, the way every coalition officer was trained, to read a target species within the first hour of contact and predict, with near total accuracy, how the engagement would end. He had run the predictive models on humanity 3 separate times since the fleet arrived. All 3 times the models had failed within minutes of real combat data coming in. Human pilots weren't following any recognizable doctrine. They were adapting mid-engagement in real time, learning the strike craft's flight patterns and punishing the same mistake differently every time it happened, as if 12 different minds were solving the same puzzle from 12 different angles and sharing the answer instantly. By the time the strike force disengaged, 4 craft lost, 8 damaged, 0 surrenders extracted, Vec had stopped taking notes for his official report and started keeping a second set, One he didn't show anyone. On the ground, the victory did not feel like one. Mara stood on the tarmac at the coastal airbase as Danny's squadron came in and counted the returning aircraft twice before she let herself believe the number. 9. They had sent out 11. She found out who was missing before Danny even climbed out of the cockpit, because she recognized the tail number that wasn't there. Aero 4, call sign Whiskey, flown by a pilot named Josh Okafor, who had transferred in from the Nigerian Air Force 8 months earlier and had, 3 weeks ago, shown Mara a photo of his daughter's first day of school on his phone in the mess hall, laughing about how she'd cried until he promised to be home for dinner. Danny pulled off her helmet and didn't say anything for a long moment. Then quietly, "He pulled a strike craft off my 6. I didn't even see it coming until he was already gone." Mara didn't offer the kind of comfort that wasn't true. She just put a hand on Danny's shoulder and let the silence do the work grief needed, because there wasn't time for more than that. The fleet in orbit was already recalculating, and somewhere above them an alien commander was deciding what to do with a species that had just proven the first hour didn't apply to it. That decision came fast, and it came ugly. Within 6 hours, 3 more coalition strike waves hit different points across the globe, probing, testing, searching for the pattern that should have already emerged. Each time, the resistance was different. Each time, it cost the coalition more than the last engagement had. It was during the third wave, while cross-referencing captured wreckage data with a research team in Geneva, that Cho found the fragment that changed the shape of everything. Buried inside the corrupted memory core of a downed strike craft, badly damaged, mostly unreadable but not completely, was a compressed archive of coalition combat doctrine, the kind of standard tactical library every ship apparently carried. Most of it was inaccessible. But one file, heavily encrypted and repeated across what looked like centuries of updates, had a label that survived the crash intact. Cho stared at the translated header for a full minute before he called anyone. The silence breed, classification, dormant, threat status, unconfirmed, protocol, withdraw on confirmation. There was no further data, no definition, no explanation of what the term meant, what species it referred to, or why an alien military doctrine centuries old had a classification sitting there with no content behind it except a single instruction, withdraw, that nobody in the coalition fleet currently orbiting Earth appeared to be following. He sent it up the chain immediately, flagged as critical, and within 20 minutes it was sitting on Mara's desk alongside combat reports from 3 continents and a growing list of names that would need to be read aloud at memorials nobody had time to plan yet. She read the fragment twice. Then she picked up the secure line to Geneva. "Dr. Cho, tell me what the silence breed means." "I don't know," Cho said, and she could hear, even over the static of the line, that it was bothering him more than he wanted to admit. "But it's not a term for us. Not yet. It's a term for something they've been afraid of for a very, very long time. And I think whatever it is, they're starting to wonder if we're it." Outside, the sun was setting over a coastline still smoking from the day's first battle, and in low orbit above it, the coalition fleet was no longer holding its cautious distance. It was regrouping, tightening formation, preparing something larger, and on the bridge of the flagship, Vec watched high-speaker Threll receive a transmission from the coalition's ruling body that made even the room's ambient lighting seem to dim, though nothing in the ship's systems had actually changed at all. Vec had never seen high-speaker Threll afraid before, and it was that, more than anything in the tactical reports, that finally convinced him something was deeply wrong. Threll stood alone at the center of the flagship's command ring, replaying the ruling body's transmission for the 4th time, and Vec, watching from his station, close enough to see but not close enough to be noticed, realized the high speaker wasn't reviewing orders anymore. He was stalling. Whatever the transmission contained, Threll had already understood it the first time, and every replay after that was just a man looking for a way to disagree with something he wasn't allowed to disagree with. Vec didn't have clearance for the ruling body's private channel, but he had clearance for the archive, and archives, unlike orders, didn't ask questions about who was reading them at 3 in the morning ship time. He started with the file fragment that had leaked in the strike craft wreckage. the silence breed, and found, as he'd expected, that the full record had been sealed centuries ago under an authorization level so old the system barely recognized it as valid anymore. But sealed records left shadows, cross-references, budget allocations, survey mission logs that referenced a classification without explaining it, written by officers who clearly knew what it meant and never once wrote the meaning down, as if the term itself were something dangerous to define. What he found, piece by piece over 6 sleepless hours, was a pattern of coalition behavior that stretched back further than any species currently in the coalition had been part of it. Every so often, decades apart, sometimes centuries, a survey fleet would report contact with a world exhibiting specific behavioral markers: rapid unified response to existential threat, tactical improvisation exceeding predictive modeling, disproportionate resistance from technologically inferior forces. And every time those markers appeared, the standing order was the same, unchanged across 1,000 years of coalition history. Withdraw immediately. Do not escalate. Report to ruling body only. Classification, the silence breed, every single time. Except this one. Vec sat back from his terminal, and for the first time since the fleet had left coalition space, he felt something closer to dread than duty. On Earth, the same 6 hours were being spent very differently. Mara had pulled together what remained of Josh Okafor's squadron and 6 international liaison officers into a windowless briefing room beneath the coastal airbase, trying to build something out of chaos before the next wave hit. Cho joined by video feed, hollow-eyed, having not slept since the wreckage data came in. "We can't win a war of attrition," Mara said, laying it out plainly, because nobody in that room needed comfort more than they needed the truth. "They have thousands of ships. We have what's left of our air forces and whatever we can improvise. If this becomes a straight fight, we lose it in days." "Then we don't fight a straight fight," said Danny, arms crossed, jaw tight in a way that hadn't softened since the tarmac. "We hit the things that matter: supply, communication, command structure. Make every engagement cost them more than it's worth." It was a plan built on desperation, but desperation, Mara had learned over the last 2 days, was apparently the one resource humanity had never run short of. Within hours, 3 coordinated strike teams, American, French, and a joint unit from India and South Korea, launched a synchronized assault on what satellite imaging had identified as a coalition supply convoy, holding position over the mid-Atlantic, resupplying the fleet's forward strike craft. It should have been suicide. Instead, using terrain-hugging low-altitude approaches no coalition sensor array had been calibrated to expect, human forces crippled 2 supply vessels and destroyed a third before coalition interceptors could respond, retreating before the counterstrike arrived. It was the single largest tactical loss the coalition fleet had suffered since arriving, and High Speaker Threll, watching the report scroll across his command display, understood immediately that his own council would not tolerate another one. That was when the second message arrived, not from Earth but for Vec. It came through an unsecured relay, buried inside a stream of routine data traffic, easy to miss unless you were looking for exactly the kind of anomaly Vec had spent the last 6 hours learning to recognize. A short burst, untraceable, addressed to no one by name, containing a single line of badly translated but unmistakably human-adjacent language. "You don't know what you are. Stop fighting like you don't know." Vec stared at it for a long time before he understood what it meant, and when he did, his hands went cold on the console. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't coalition. It was something else entirely. A warning, sent from somewhere he couldn't trace, meant for humanity, but delivered by accident into a coalition data stream where only he had been paying close enough attention to catch it. He made a decision then that would have ended his career, or his life, under any normal circumstances. He rerouted the message, buried inside a corrupted diagnostic packet, toward the nearest human communications array, and prayed someone on the other end was paying as much attention as he was. He was not wrong to pray. Cho caught it 4 minutes later, isolated the fragment from the noise around it, and read the translated line 3 times before calling Mara at 2 in the morning, with a voice that had lost all its exhaustion. "Someone inside the fleet is talking to us," he said, "and they're telling us we don't understand what we're dealing with." Mara didn't get the chance to ask what that meant. Because at that exact moment, alarms began screaming across every defense station on the eastern seaboard, and the tactical display lit up with a single coalition vessel breaking from the main fleet. Not a strike craft, not a supply ship, but something far larger. Its silhouette matching nothing in any database humanity had built in 2 days of desperate cataloging. On the bridge of the flagship, Threll gave the order his ruling body had demanded, the one he'd spent 6 hours trying to avoid giving. His voice, when it finally came, had none of the calm certainty from the first broadcast 3 days earlier. Arm the Oblivion Directive. Vec heard the order over the ship's internal channel and felt the floor of his convictions give way entirely. Whatever the silence breed was, whatever humanity actually represented, the Coalition's answer to uncertainty had just become the only answer it had ever truly trusted: overwhelming, irreversible force. And 3,000 miles below, every human device with a working antenna flickered, for exactly 4 seconds, with a signal none of them could explain, ancient and patterned and utterly unlike anything the Coalition had ever transmitted before. The Oblivion Directive did not look like a weapon when it fired. It looked like the sky tearing. A line of white light split the upper atmosphere above the Atlantic, silent for the first 2 seconds because sound hadn't caught up to the violence yet, and then the shock wave hit, and every window within 400 miles of the coast shattered at once. Mara felt it through the floor of the command bunker before the alarms even finished their first cycle. A deep, bone-level wrongness, like the planet itself had flinched. "Report," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt, because steadiness was the only thing she had left to give the room. "Impact trajectory adjusted," the tactical officer said, staring at a screen that didn't make sense to him even as he read it aloud. "It's not hitting the coast. Ma'am, it's aimed at the defense grid, all of it. Every intercept platform we have in range." Humanity's answer to that single beam of light was the largest coordinated defensive effort in the history of the species. Every missile battery, every laser point defense system, every scrap of tracking and targeting technology from 11 different nations firing in the same 6-second window, stitched together not by shared command architecture, because there hadn't been time to build one, but by raw human stubbornness relayed over open channels in 4 different languages shouted between operators who had never trained together, and somehow impossibly moved as one. It wasn't enough to stop the weapon, but it was enough to bend it. The beam that should have vaporized 6 cities instead struck a fractured, partially intercepted path across the outskirts of 3, and even diminished, even fragmented by a defense grid never designed to survive contact with something like it. The destruction was catastrophic. Mara watched the casualty numbers climb in real time on a side monitor, and made herself keep watching, because looking away wouldn't make the number smaller, and the people dying under that light deserved at least the dignity of someone counting. It was, by every measure that mattered, the darkest hour humanity had faced since the fleet arrived, and it was in the wreckage of that hour, hunting for anything that might explain what had just happened, that Cho found the thing that changed the entire war. The ancient signal, the 4-second flicker every device on Earth had caught during the directive's launch, hadn't come from the Coalition fleet. His recovery team confirmed it within an hour of grueling analysis. The signal structure was too old, too degraded, layered with encoding patterns that predated every modern human transmission protocol by a margin that made no sense. It wasn't alien in origin. It was buried inside the Coalition's own historical archive, a recording centuries old that their systems had automatically rebroadcast the instant certain trigger conditions were met. Conditions tied somehow to the Oblivion Directive's activation. Cho isolated the signal, cleaned it as best he could, and played it through a translation matrix built for a language nobody on his team recognized. What came out wasn't Coalition speech. It was something older, harsher, more human in cadence than anything an alien throat should have been able to replicate, and buried inside the noise, unmistakable even through the corruption, was a repeating fragment that resolved, after 3 passes, into something disturbingly close to a name, not a Coalition name, not an alien word at all, a pattern that matched, loosely but undeniably, ancient human linguistic roots older than any surviving written language on Earth. Cho stared at the readout for a long time before he took it to Mara, because he didn't yet have words for what he was looking at, only the growing, uncomfortable certainty that the mystery wasn't about who the coalition was. It was about who humanity used to be. He never got the chance to explain it properly, because that was the moment Vec arrived. Badly injured, half carried through a breach in a downed relay pod that had crash-landed 6 miles from the bunker, dragged in by a recovery team that hadn't known what to do with an alien who kept repeating, in broken but functional English, that he needed to speak to whoever was in charge. Mara met him in a makeshift medical bay, flanked by armed guards who clearly wanted to shoot first, and looked down at a creature who looked less like the conquering monster from the broadcasts, and more like a young man who hadn't slept in days and had run out of places to hide from what he knew. "You sent the message," she said. Not a question. Vec nodded, wincing as a medic worked on a wound along his side. "I have been intelligence officer on Threll's ship for 2 years. I have run every predictive model we own on your species. None of them worked. Do you know why?" "Enlighten me." "Because the models were not built for a species that has never fought a war like this. They were built for a species that has fought this war before, and simply does not remember doing it." The room went very quiet. "The Coalition did not come here to conquer a new world," Vec continued, forcing the words out through obvious pain, as if saying them cost him something physical. "We came here to test one. There is a record, sealed for longer than my civilization has been part of the Coalition, of a species that nearly ended us the first time we found it. We do not know when. We do not know how. We only know the protocol that was written afterward and followed without exception for 1,000 years, until 3 days ago." Mara felt something cold settle behind her ribs. "What protocol?" "Withdraw, do not engage, report, and retreat." Vec's eyes, alien and unreadable but unmistakably exhausted, found hers. "Every time for 1,000 years, until a faction within our own ruling body decided your species had slept long enough to be tested again, and pressured Threll into breaking the one rule that has kept the Coalition alive since before your written history began." Mara opened her mouth to ask the question that mattered most, the one that had been building since the 6-hour countdown first appeared on every screen on Earth, but Vec answered it before she could speak, his voice dropping into something that sounded, for the first time, less like an intelligence report and more like a confession made by someone who genuinely believed it. "You already beat us once," he said. "You just don't remember doing it." Outside, the sky was still burning where the directive's fragmented beam had scorched its path across the horizon, and somewhere above the smoke, the Coalition fleet was recalculating its next move. But for the first time since the countdown had begun 3 days earlier, Mara realized the war they thought they were fighting was not the war that had actually started, and the ground beneath everything she understood about her own species had just, quietly and irreversibly, shifted. The record, when Cho's team finally pieced it together, was older than anything humanity had ever called history. It took 18 hours of joint work between Cho's linguists, a team of archaeologists pulled from 3 continents, and Vec himself, weak, wired to a jury-rigged medical monitor, but lucid enough to guide them through Coalition archive structures no human had ever seen, to reconstruct even a fraction of what the sealed files actually contained. What emerged was not a clean story. It was a mosaic of survey logs, redacted mission reports, and a handful of surviving fragments from an encounter so old that the Coalition itself had only inherited the fear of it, generation after generation, without ever fully understanding what had caused it. Long before recorded human history, before the first cities, before writing, before anything a modern textbook would recognize as civilization, a Coalition survey fleet had made contact with a world it catalogued only by coordinates, in a system that Cho, cross-referencing stellar drift calculations with visible burn scars, would eventually confirm was Earth's own solar neighborhood, adjusted for 10,000 years of orbital movement. The survey fleet's own logs described a species with no unified language, no shared technology, scattered across the planet in small, disconnected groups. By every metric the Coalition used to assess a world's threat level, primitive beyond consideration. The survey mission was meant to be routine, reconnaissance only, no contact protocol engaged. Something had gone wrong. The final surviving log entry, badly corrupted, described the loss of the survey fleet's forward scout vessel under circumstances the officer recording it could not explain, not destroyed by any weapon the coalition possessed sensors to detect, but overwhelmed, the log said, by something the surviving crew described only in fragments. Coordinated resistance from groups that shouldn't have been capable of coordinating at all, adapting to coalition technology within hours of first exposure, turning captured equipment back on its owners with a speed that defied every model the coalition had ever built for technological disparity. The mission commander's last transmission, before the surviving ships fled the system entirely, was the fragment that had haunted coalition doctrine for 10,000 years, the one Cho finally translated in full, sitting in a room gone completely silent around him. They should not have been able to do this. They learned faster than we could adapt. They fought like a single mind wearing 1,000 bodies, and when we retreated, they did not celebrate. They simply stopped, as if victory had never been the point at all. Classify as dormant. Do not return. If they wake again, they must never see us as a threat worth remembering, because a species like this, given purpose, given unity, given time, will not stop at survival. Nobody in the room spoke for a long moment after Cho finished reading it aloud. That's not a war record, Mara said finally quietly. That's a species writing down that they're afraid of us and hoping we'll forget how to be dangerous before we remember we ever were. It worked, Vex said from the medical cot, his voice thin but clear. For 10,000 years it worked. Your species forgot. You built civilizations, fought each other, nearly destroyed yourselves 100 different ways, and never once looked up and wondered why nothing from beyond your own sky had ever come to claim you. We made certain of that. Every faction in the coalition that has ever proposed re-establishing contact with your world has been overruled, for 1,000 years, by leaders too frightened of what re-waking you might mean. So what changed? Mara asked. Why now? Vex's expression, alien as it was, carried something that looked unmistakably like shame. A new faction rose within the ruling body 8 years ago, younger, hungrier. They argued the old fear was superstition, that a species without spaceflight 3 days ago could not possibly be the same threat described in a 10,000-year-old log. They pushed for a controlled test. Overwhelming force, immediate withdrawal authority if the old markers reappeared. Threll did not want this mission. He was ordered to prove the fear was obsolete. And instead? Instead, you did exactly what the log said you would do. You adapted faster than any predictive model could account for. You fought as if 1,000 different minds were making the same decision at once. And when we hurt you, badly, catastrophically, you did not break. You simply kept finding a way to hurt us back. Vec looked at her, and for the first time since he'd arrived, his voice carried something that wasn't fear or exhaustion, but something closer to awe. You are not dormant. You never were. You simply forgot what you're capable of, and the not knowing is somehow the most dangerous part of all. The silence that followed was broken by the comms officer, whose voice cracked through the room with an urgency that pulled everyone back to the present. Ma'am, Coalition fleet-wide broadcast, all channels, all languages. It's Threll. They played it on the main screen. Threll stood alone at the center of his command ring, and for the first time since the 6-hour ultimatum 3 days earlier, his voice carried none of the manufactured calm the Coalition had scripted for him. To the ruling body of the Coalition of Vashtar, and to the people of Earth, he said, I was sent here to test a fear 10,000 years old, and I have found that fear was never wrong, only misunderstood. This is not a dormant threat. This is a species that has spent 10,000 years forgetting a strength we should have left buried. I will not be the officer who wakes it fully for the sake of a political argument I never believed in. He paused, and something in his voice, alien as it was, cracked in a way that sounded almost human. Effective immediately, I am ordering full withdrawal of Coalition strike forces, and I am requesting, without ruling body authorization, formal parley with the government of Earth. The command room erupted, officers shouting, systems flooding with updates, a wave of disbelief and cautious hope crashing through people who had spent 3 days bracing for annihilation. Mara didn't move. She was watching the screen, watching Threll's ship begin visibly to power down its forward weapons array in real time. A gesture of surrender so total it should have ended the war right there. It didn't. A second coalition vessel, larger, older, marked with insignia Vec identified instantly as belonging to the war faction that had pushed for this invasion from the start, broke from the retreating fleet and turned without warning, its full weapons battery bearing not on Earth but on Threll's flagship. "They're going to kill him," Vec said, struggling upright against the medic's protests, his voice rising into something close to panic. "They would rather destroy their own commander than let the coalition admit what you are." On the tactical display, the dreadnought's weapons began to charge, and Mara Osi, who had spent 3 days learning exactly how fast humanity could adapt when given no other choice, was already turning toward the door, giving an order nobody in that room expected to hear. "Scramble everything we have left. We're not letting them do this." Nobody in that command room understood in the first confused seconds after Mara gave the order why humanity's last surviving squadrons were about to fly into battle to save the life of the alien commander who had tried to destroy 3 cities 6 hours earlier. Danny Reyes understood it before anyone had to explain it to her. "You're serious," she said over the open channel, already running for her aircraft, already pulling on her helmet, because she'd learned in 3 days of war that Mara Ose did not give orders she hadn't already thought all the way through. "If the war faction kills Threll, the coalition never has to answer for what it just admitted on live broadcast," Mara said. "No withdrawal, no parley, just a dead officer, a cover story, and a fleet that goes right back to finishing what it started. We didn't survive 3 days for that." It became known afterward in the handful of accounts that survived to be written down properly as the 3 hours, the stretch of time between Threll's broadcast and the moment the war finally, truly ended, though almost nobody who lived through it experienced it as anything but chaos. What remained of Earth's air forces, battered, exhausted flying aircraft held together with improvisation and stubbornness, launched directly into the teeth of a coalition civil conflict nobody had trained for and nobody fully understood. Danny's squadron, down to 6 aircraft from the original 11, punched through the dreadnought's outer defensive screen using the same terrain-blind, pattern-breaking tactics that had worked since the very first engagement, buying Threll's loyalist ships the seconds they needed to reposition. On the ground, Cho stayed in the command room feeding real-time translation to Threll's loyalist forces, so human and coalition ships could coordinate without a single shared tactical language between them. An absurd, half-improvised system of color-coded signal bursts and rapid text relay that should never have worked and somehow did, because both sides wanted, for entirely different reasons, for it too. Vec, against every medical order, pulled himself from the cot and commandeered a relay pod still docked at the crash site. Flying it, wounded, alone, barely conscious from blood loss, directly into the path of a war faction cruiser bearing down on a human evacuation convoy fleeing the scorched coastline below. He had no weapons capable of stopping it. He rammed it anyway, close enough to force the cruiser off its firing line, and the last transmission anyone received from him was 3 words, badly translated, sent on an open channel to no one in particular. "Tell them, sorry, the convoy survived." Vec did not. Mara heard the report an hour later, standing in the command room with casualty lists that had not stopped growing since the countdown began 3 days earlier, and allowed herself, for just a moment, to grieve a creature she had known for less than a day, because he had spent that day trying to save a species that had every reason to kill him on sight, and had chosen not to. The war faction's dreadnought finally broke apart under combined fire 2 hours and 40 minutes after Threll's broadcast, its remaining loyalist crew surrendering rather than dying for a cause their own commander had publicly disowned. Threll's flagship, damaged but intact, drifted at the center of a fleet that had, in the space of 3 hours, fractured and reformed around a single, unthinkable idea: that the thing they had come to destroy had just spent its last strength protecting the man who tried to destroy it. The formal transmission came 4 hours later, once the fighting had fully stopped and both sides had counted what remained. Threll, standing amid a bridge crew visibly shaken by everything the last 3 days had cost them, requested to speak not to a government, not to a military command, but specifically to the officer whose forces had saved his ship. Mara took the call standing, because some conversations deserve to be met on your feet. "You had every tactical reason to let the war faction kill me," Threll said. "It would have ended in your favor either way. Withdrawal, or a dead commander used as a martyr for further invasion. Either result served your survival better than risking your remaining forces to save an enemy. You stopped being our enemy the moment you turned off your weapons," Mara said. "We don't know how to explain that to you in a way your models will accept. We just know it's true." There was a long pause on the line, alien and human both searching, in their own ways, for words equal to the weight of the last 3 days. 10,000 years ago," Threll said finally, "my people wrote you off as something to fear and forget because we could not imagine a species with your capacity for violence also carrying this willingness to spend what little you had left protecting something you had every reason to destroy. I do not think we understood you then. I do not think we fully understand you now. But I am formally requesting recognition, unconditional and without further test, on behalf of what remains of my authority within the coalition." It was not the surrender anyone had expected 3 days earlier, when the 6-hour ultimatum first split the sky. It was something else. An apology written in the only language the coalition had ever truly trusted, the language of withdrawal, offered not out of fear this time, but out of something that, however imperfectly, resembled respect. The formal ceremony, when it happened weeks later, was small and quiet, held not in a grand hall, but on the same tarmac where Danny Reyes had once counted 9 returning aircraft out of 11, and felt the weight of every number that didn't add up. Cho stood as Earth's first envoy, delivering a closing statement to the wider coalition in careful, ceremonial phrasing that had taken his team days to get exactly right, because some things needed to be said perfectly or not at all. "You wrote us into your history as something to fear and forget," he said, his voice carrying across a crowd of both human and coalition officers standing side by side for the first time. "We didn't remember what we were. We just remembered what we refused to be, and that turned out to be enough." Mara stood at the edge of the tarmac afterward, watching human engineers and coalition technicians work together on the wreckage of a downed relay pod, repairing what could be repaired, honoring in small, practical ways the sacrifice of the one coalition officer who had chosen to believe in them before anyone gave him a reason to. The sky above them was clear for the first time in weeks, dawn breaking pale gold over a coastline still scarred, but no longer burning. Far above, in a coalition archive sealed for 10,000 years and finally, cautiously being reopened, a data technician on Threll's flagship noticed something that made her stop scrolling and sit very still. Buried among the other files the Silence Breed's classification had once silenced alongside humanity's. Other names, other coordinates, other worlds cataloged the same way and never revisited. Several long-dormant records had, without any command entered by anyone, quietly begun to update themselves, as if something out there, after 10,000 years of stillness, had just noticed the silence finally breaking, and decided it was time to wake up too.